Okay, guys, I'm here today with John Danaher. Huge honor for me as always. We are here in the Boston waterfront, in front of the Boston Harbor. And guys, we just finished our John Go for the Faster series, which was amazing. It was one of the best success in BJJ Fanatics. And now we're about to start a new series with John. It's called the Feet to Floor. So, John, can you explain to us a little more about that?
One of the subject matters in jiu-jitsu which tends to get a little overlooked both in the gym and also in video production is standing skills. And people always ask, are you going to put out a video, an instructional video on takedowns for jiu-jitsu? And I decided to go one better. Instead of just putting out a collection of takedowns, which, to be honest with you, I don't think is going to help many students very much, we created instead a video literally called Feet to Floor. The title of the video is not takedowns, it's Feet to Floor. So what does that mean? It means that jiu-jitsu has a pretty wide range of skills in the standing position. Takedowns are one of those skills. And Feet to Floor as a series is going to cover the full range of jiu-jitsu skills. Okay, first, in jiu-jitsu you have to understand that unlike judo, for example, there are two categories of takedowns in jiu-jitsu. There are takedowns where you're in front of your opponent, and there are takedowns where you're behind your opponent. Always understand, of course, that in judo, if you throw your opponent down to hands and knees, that scores nothing. It's a score of 0 in judo. But if you can hold your opponent's knee down to the floor for 2 seconds in jiu-jitsu, that's a takedown. So we have two forms of takedown: front takedowns and back takedowns, or rear takedowns in the sport of jiu-jitsu. And of course, there's many other skills in the standing position in jiu-jitsu. You have to be able to pull guard effectively. I know many people disparage guard pulling in the sport of jiu-jitsu, but let's be honest, it's an important part of the standing position in competition jiu-jitsu. If you don't know how to pull guard effectively, it's hard to be effective in the standing position in the sport of jiu-jitsu. In Feet to Floor, we're going to be looking at some interesting new theories of pulling guard. I think we can be a lot more creative in jiu-jitsu in the way in which we pull guard to immediately go in and score points, and take guard pulling from being a passive, almost defeatist approach to the standing position to one where it's an active point scoring approach. And I'm actually very excited to show this stuff in the Feet to Floor series, because I really think that jiu-jitsu players with just a little creativity and a little bit of training could make the whole process of pulling guard much more effective than it currently is in competition. Of course, we also have to be able to stop someone else pulling guard on us, or not stop them, but at least be able to deal with it, because it's one of the most common scenarios in sport jiu-jitsu. And of course, there's the whole idea of countering a takedown. If someone tries a takedown on us, we need techniques to be able to stop it. So that's another skill that we need to show in the Feet to Floor series. And there's also going to be something which gets a little underplayed. That's the idea of pulling, not guard, but pulling an opponent into a submission hold from the standing position. So you see, really, there's quite a few skills to jiu-jitsu in the standing position. It's not just about takedowns. It's about front takedowns, back takedowns, pulling guard effectively, preventing someone else from pulling guard effectively on you, and pulling people into submissions from the standing position. So Feet to Floor as a series will incorporate all of those skills. It's not just about takedowns. It's about the complete set of skills that ought to be manifested by jiu-jitsu students in competitive situations.
Got it. But John, I think that's very, very interesting, because I think this is a part of jiu-jitsu that's not explored at all. And it's hard to explore, because, for example, I remember growing up, like my first instructor, which I went from white to black belt, he didn't have any background on standing. So it was even hard for him to teach standing, and it was hard for me to learn standing. We almost didn't know what to do, like we would play around standing like every day here and there. And I think it's only very, very, very few instructors that they do have some background in judo or wrestling or something like that, and they can mix that with jiu-jitsu. So I think it's something that all the jiu-jitsu practitioners miss a lot.
Let me say something about this, Bernardo. This is a great point you're raising here. If you go into a beginner's class in any jiu-jitsu school in the world, Brazil, United States, Europe, Australia, anywhere, okay? You go into a beginner's class and you talk to a white belt jiu-jitsu student who's been training 2-3 weeks. Okay, maybe he's only had 6, 10 classes. And if he's down on the floor, he or she is down on the floor, and you ask him a question, what should you be doing right now in this sparring situation? They can almost always give you a pretty clear answer. If they're in the bottom of the mounted position, they can tell you, well, I should be trying to get out of the mount and put my opponent back in guard. If they're caught between their opponent's legs in the guard position, they should say, well, I'm probably should be getting past my opponent's legs and getting to a dominant pin. If they're in the mounted position, they might say to you, well, I should be looking for a stranglehold or an arm lock. They can give you a pretty good answer as to what they ought to be doing at any point down on the ground. But if you took those same students, not even at white belt level, but at blue belt, purple belt, brown belt, and you ask them, what should you be doing in the standing position? They look at you like, I don't really know. I think I get a hold of him and I pull guard. The disparity between the knowledge that jiu-jitsu students exhibit on the floor, where they have a very good idea right from the start as to what they ought to be doing at any given moment in a match, where jiu-jitsu students on average are very impressive in this regard. You can take a guy who's been training for 2 weeks and he can tell you in very clear, very orderly language exactly what he ought to be doing at any time down on the floor. And then standing position, there's just no answer. It's like, I don't know, I get a grip on the guy, I guess I'm just going to pull guard.
No, and then I remember, like, again, when I started jiu-jitsu, in the beginning, I would do close guard. And the reason I would do close guard with everybody when I was like white and yellow belt was because I wanted to pull guard as fast as I could. I didn't want to be standing for like 10 seconds because I knew I didn't have any standing background. And it was the same thing with half guard, because at some point I couldn't close the guard anymore. So half guard was the easiest way that I had to start the match. I just had to jump sideways, but I wish I had that standing game.
What I see among so many students in jiu-jitsu is that when they look at the standing position, they look at a guard pull as something they have to do. There's no choice. They have to do it because there's no alternative. They don't have any other skills. What I would like in the future is to see jiu-jitsu students pull guard not because they have to, but because they want to. In other words, they have alternatives. They could have gone for a takedown. They could have gone for a standing submission. But they decide that tactically, in this particular match, I'm going to pull guard. As opposed to, that's the only game I got. I have no alternative. I want to see jiu-jitsu players in the future deciding to pull guard because they want to. Because for this particular match, it's the tactically sound thing to do, not because they have no alternative. They should have some kind of alternative. They should be able to attempt takedowns from front and back. They should be able to attempt standing submission entries. And I want to see in the future, as I said, a generation of jiu-jitsu students who see guard pulling as one choice amongst many, rather than it's the only game I've got.
No, enjoy. And I think like your squad back it up everything you're saying, because if you think about like Gordon is not a wrestler, but you see him taking down people all the time.
Think about the finals of ADCC.
He
got 3 takedowns by knee pick and made it look relatively effortless. That's for a gold medal match against a guy who I believe won silver at the World Championships in the gi, and obviously was a silver medalist in ADCC. This is a high-level opponent. And yet Gordon, who never wrestled a day in his life, was able to hit 3 beautiful takedowns. My point is simple. And this goes back to probably one of my most well-known students, George St. Pierre. Many of you know George St. Pierre as one of the premier takedown artists of mixed martial arts history, if not the greatest of all time.
And has never done wrestling in his life, right?
He never wrestled competitively in his life. Now, he studied wrestling and has many high-level wrestling partners, but he was never a competitive wrestler. He did not grow up wrestling. He started wrestling when he was 18 or 19. Now, ordinarily, you would think that would be a huge disadvantage. If he went up against great MMA wrestlers like Josh Koscheck, John Fitch, Johnny Hendricks, you would think, well, these guys started wrestling when they were 5 years old, and they wrestled competitively all the way up to college and beyond. So he would never be able to take them down, right? And yet, if you look at his fights, he took them all down on multiple occasions. Now, why was he able to do that? It's because the rules of mixed martial arts and the conditions and directives of mixed martial arts are considerably different from wrestling. All the setups, all the distancing, the stances, everything is different from wrestling. And under those circumstances, someone like Georges St-Pierre, who had no formal background in wrestling up until relatively late age, was able to outperform wrestlers. Now, could he beat those same wrestlers in an actual wrestling match? Absolutely not.
Yep.
Okay, George's only focus in wrestling is in takedowns. If he fought a really good wrestler in freestyle wrestling, for example, he would easily be turned on the ground with leg laces and gut wrenches.
MMA rules,
but under MMA
or
rules.
on jiu-jitsu rules.
Now, my point is, a jiu-jitsu player who might ordinarily struggle badly against a wrestler in a wrestling match or against a judo player in a judo match could, with training in the future and future generations, could even defeat supposedly better wrestlers and judo players under jiu-jitsu rules.
Okay, not in the wrestling rules.
It wouldn't beat them in wrestling, wouldn't beat them in judo, but under jiu-jitsu rules, there will come a day in the future where I believe that jiu-jitsu athletes will be able to outperform highly seasoned, experienced standing grapplers from other arts in a jiu-jitsu rules, just as Georges St-Pierre outperformed technically better wrestlers under mixed martial arts rules.
Right.
Now, as we said, could George beat them in a wrestling match? I believe it would be competitive, but I don't believe he would beat them in their specific rule sets.
Okay.
But our job is to create a situation in the future where jiu-jitsu students understand the unique aspects of jiu-jitsu standing game, which is substantially different from wrestling, substantially different from judo, and develop a mature jiu-jitsu standing game. And I believe they can be highly effective.
Okay, and John, I think another example as well from your squad is Gary, right? Because he had one of the most beautiful takedowns in the ADCC against Dante.
Yes.
And also, like, all his game is about like submissions coming from the standing game.
position.
So,
there's a whole set of skills of standing entries into submissions, which is so underdeveloped in current jiu-jitsu that it's a crying shame, to be honest with you. And I've always been extraordinarily proud of Gary's development of standing entries into submissions. Like you see, he hits a beautiful scissor or kani basami into heel hooks, entries into all manner of leg locks, rolling entries, sliding entries. He can go up a body and attack arm locks and triangles. And this is an underdeveloped aspect of jiu-jitsu, and I would love to show some of these aspects in the feet to floor series.
That makes a lot of sense. And while you were talking, I was thinking here, so for example, and those who take a little bit of advantage of that, for example, if you think in the jiu-jitsu with Gui, for example, Rodolfo Vieira, Jacaré,
they scored a lot of points.
They made some damage.
They scored a lot of points and won a lot of matches with takedowns. My point to you is this, Bernardo. The current state of standing skills in jiu-jitsu is that there are a few outstanding athletes who have done, I believe, a great job of incorporating standing skills into jiu-jitsu. You've already mentioned a couple of great examples. Jacaré used to use very nice judo. Now, what was it, world level judo? No, absolutely not. If he entered a high level judo tournament, he'd be thrown in a matter of seconds. But for jiu-jitsu purposes, it was damn good. Rodolfo Vieira, another great example. Rodolfo had very effective takedowns. Now, would Rodolfo go into a judo tournament and beat people? No, absolutely not.
Even Buchecha?
Yeah, Buchecha has very effective, it's not pretty, but he has an effective double leg takedown and it works. He gets it to work under the conditions of jiu-jitsu. Your great friend, the guy you like so much, Urbis Santos. I had to throw that in there, Bernardo. You have to admit, Urbis got a very good standing game. He's got an excellent jiu-jitsu standing game. He does it really well, and I'm impressed by him.
And it's hard to start a match against
it's difficult, and if you look at someone like Rodolfo and Urbis, they have skills which are engineered specifically for the jiu-jitsu game. And I believe even if they fought a good wrestler or a good judo player under jiu-jitsu rules, they do pretty well. Now, would they go into a judo tournament or a wrestling tournament and beat people? No, absolutely not. But they would be very effective in the standing position against
I
grappler.
have seen like jiu-jitsu guys taking down Olympic judo guys just because the rules are completely different. They're not
I'm going to give you an example right now. My own student, Travis Stevens, who's one of the best judo players of his generation around the world, was taken down by Yuri Samoy with a simple collar drag when they fought each other. Now, if you had Travis and Yuri go in a judo match, Travis is going to throw him all day, every day. But under jiu-jitsu rules, Yuri Samoy took down Travis Stevens with a pretty simple takedown, a collar drag. It's not a difficult takedown to perform.
I remember like Léo Leite, for example. He was like from the Brazilian
and he was
team,
very good at judo.
And Bochecha was able to take him down. Times,
And Léo Leite, I believe he was like
he was from the Brazilian team.
He was on the Brazilian squad.
Yeah.
And guys, if you don't know, the Brazilian judo squad is a damn good one. It's one of the premier squads in the world. It's not like Brazil has a weak judo team. They're very, very good. They have some outstanding individuals. To get on their squad, you have to be very, very good in judo. It's impressive. And for Bochecha to take down a guy like that under jiu-jitsu rules, that's an impressive achievement on Bochecha's part. So my point is that there may well be a future where jiu-jitsu players, if they put their mind to it and they train hard in the standing position under jiu-jitsu rules with the peculiar aspects of the standing game in jiu-jitsu, which is substantially different from wrestling and judo, could be very effective.
And John, this one has a little bit of background, not a little bit, has some background on wrestling, but see the damage that Nick Rod makes in no-gi just because he has the wrestling plus his jiu-jitsu. But
our point is that if you can find a way to integrate standing skills, it's not like, I think a lot of people have this fear that they're worried that they could spend a lot of time working standing skills and have no reward because everyone's just going to pull guard on them. If they find out they're good at takedowns, everyone's just going to pull guard. And yet, history has shown very clearly that people who have good standing skills, if they're creative, can find ways to incorporate and score points in international competition. Nicky Rod did it at ADCC. Bochecha does it regularly in jiu-jitsu competition. Everyone knows Bochecha's got a good double leg, and yet he still scores with it. Everyone knows that Rodolfo Vieira's got good takedowns, but he still scores with them. Okay, our point is time spent in the standing position is time well spent. It's not just something where you do it because it might be beneficial to you or you feel like you have a duty to learn jiu-jitsu. History has shown very clearly that there's an outstanding group of athletes who regularly score and win matches with standing skills.
No, I agree 100%. And Joe, you're very optimistic about people learning standing skills, and it's hard. Why you're so optimistic about that?
That's a great question. If I asked you a question, Bernardo, no one loves jiu-jitsu more than you. Okay, everyone involved in sport loves jiu-jitsu. But if you said there were a couple of weaknesses in jiu-jitsu from the earliest days, okay, if you could point to the biggest weaknesses in jiu-jitsu, I believe your answer would be the same as mine. That from its birth, jiu-jitsu always carried two big weaknesses within it. The first was leg locks. For 80 to 100 years, jiu-jitsu was weak on leg locks. Like they were there, but kind of, sort of, but not really emphasized. And the other is takedown / standing position. Okay? If I could, as much as we love jiu-jitsu, if we could offer a straightforward criticism of jiu-jitsu, it would be along those two lines. The two biggest weaknesses since the creation of jiu-jitsu as a modern sport would be leg locks and standing position.
I agree.
Okay? I think pretty much everyone would agree with us on this.
Yep.
Now, if you look at the last 10 years in jiu-jitsu, would you still say that leg locks is the biggest weakness in jiu-jitsu?
No, that changed it.
I think that's changed.
Yeah.
I think we can honestly say at this point that leg locks have gone from being a weakness to a strength.
Yeah.
Like, if you asked me in 2005, if you took the 10 best guys in jiu-jitsu in a leg lock battle against other grappling arts, I wouldn't have a lot of faith. Maybe a few of them, maybe Dean Lister back then would do well.
Yeah.
A few others, there would be a few exceptions to the rule.
Yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking about that because Dean Lister, he came and he cleaned it, only using leg locks.
Yeah.
Only using leg locks, nothing else. But nobody knew how to learn that.
There was nothing to, there was no It was just like a few individuals.
And then there was one another one like Toquinho, right? But then you came and you pretty much changed the game with that. Now everybody does leg locks, everybody does heel hooks.
In 2020, if you went to ADCC and you took someone from another grappling style who was adept in leg locks in their style, they would struggle against the new generation jiu-jitsu players, let me tell you. Okay, the new generation jiu-jitsu players aren't just good with leg locks, they're great with leg locks. And I believe it's a pretty accurate thing for us to say that jiu-jitsu has gone from leg locks being a weakness to the new generation of jiu-jitsu players, it's a strength. Like I would confidently take people like Gary Tonin, Gordon Ryan, Eddie Cummings, Lachlan Giles, and I would confidently, Craig Jones obviously, put them against anyone in the world. You show me anyone who claims to be this style has great leg locks. I would put any one of those guys against them and have absolute confidence they would either prevail easily or at least it's going to be highly competitive. I wouldn't have had that confidence, say, 15 or 20 years ago with the leading guys in the sport. Maybe a few exceptions like Dean or Toquinho, a few others. But let's be honest, in 10 years, the game has changed substantially. And a weakness has become a strength. My point is this, Bernardo. Why can't we do the same thing with standing position? If we did it with leg locks, why can't we do it with standing position? Okay, I will agree with you that currently the standing game in jiu-jitsu is underdeveloped. There's a few outstanding individuals, just like there was with leg locks, who do really well. But the overall state of standing position in jiu-jitsu it's not good. It's not healthy. The same way that leg locks wasn't in 2005. Okay, but I'm an optimist about the standing position based on my experience with the legs. Okay, leg locks used to be a great weakness of jiu-jitsu. Now they're a raging strength. Now, if you took me into ADCC and I randomly selected 10 of the new generation athletes, I would confidently put them against anyone in the world on leg locks. Okay, who's to say that 10 years from now we can't do the same thing with standing skills? If we put in the same dedication that we did with leg locks, why can't we do the same thing? That's why I'm an optimist.
That makes sense, John. No, and as we talked, like I think it's an entire world that's not explored at all. And even when you explore bringing like wrestlers to teach or judo to teach, it's different because there's that very big sense of the...
Now, I want to talk about that difference in detail in a few minutes because I think that's... Now you're starting to really cut to the chase as to what's important in this video series, because there are massive differences between the other different grappling styles that we draw upon, and we'll talk about that in detail. But I will say, Bernardo, that since its inception, jiu-jitsu has always struggled in those two areas, leg locks and standing position. We turned it around with leg locks. We can do the same thing with the standing game.
I believe, John. I believe. And I think everybody's crazy excited to learn this as well, like how to be efficient when you're standing, and it's such a beautiful part of jiu-jitsu. If you watch one match, there is a very nice takedown very in the beginning of the match.
It's really, yeah. You can always tell when, I hate to say this, but it's so true, like no one can deny it. Picture the difference in a match where two guys come out and just go toe-to-toe standing position in a takedown battle. You're sitting watching going, ooh, this is good. As opposed to double guard pull, where everyone's just like, oh man, is this really happening? There's a big difference there. And it's a thrilling part of the game. It's a very satisfying part of the game. There's not many feelings better than hitting someone with a good takedown. It's like, ooh, that was nice, So I'm excited to teach this stuff.
Yeah, no, John, I have no doubts that's going to be as good as enter the system and go for the fastest was. So, John, what's the basic goal of the Feet to Floor series, especially the first part of the series?
If you look at the sister sport of jiu-jitsu, which is judo, okay, Brazilian jiu-jitsu was pretty much derived from judo historically. The early originators of jiu-jitsu, people like Maeda and others, were originally students of Kano, the founder of judo. If you look at the sister sport of judo, what you often find with elite level competitors is you will see they are absolute killers in the standing position. Okay, these guys can throw you every which way but Sunday. They get a hold of you, they're going to toss you. Okay, and it's deeply impressive to watch. And you also find that in addition to being killers on the feet, they're also pretty competent on the ground. Like they're not bad on the ground. Okay, it may not be their specialty. There's a few outstanding individuals, people like Flavio Canto, Travis Stevens. Yep. They are killers on the feet and they're killers on the ground. Like they can go with elite level jiu-jitsu black belts and it's a hell of a match, okay? But the majority of judo players, what you find at the upper echelons is they're absolute killers on the feet and they're highly competent on the ground, okay? Now, when you compare that with most jiu-jitsu players, what you see is the jiu-jitsu players are killers on the ground, but I hate to say it, but they're incompetent on the feet, okay? There's a huge disparity between their competency on the ground, which is extremely high, and their competency on the feet, which is not really where it should be. What I would like to do is create a situation where jiu-jitsu players are known as killers on the ground and competent on the feet. What we don't want is situations where they're killers on the ground but straightforwardly incompetent in the standing position. Okay, just as judo is primarily concerned with the standing position, but everyone's competent on the floor, we're known as primarily ground fighters, so we're killers on the ground, but we should also be at least competent on the feet. You shouldn't go through your entire jiu-jitsu career just being incompetent in the standing position. You don't even know what you're supposed to do. So you just come out, grab a guy by the cloth and just sit down, okay? So my minimum long-term goal for jiu-jitsu players is they should, even though the primary part of their training, of course, has to be on the ground. That's where most of the points are scored. That's where most of the match is fought. That's where 90% of the training time is spent. So, of course, that should be their primary goal, become absolute killers on the floor. But they should also at least be competent in the standing position. What we can't have is situations where they're killers on the ground but incompetent on the feet.
I agree. No, and then if you think about it, right, John, like I think in judo and in jiu-jitsu, so those names that you mentioned in judo, like Travis, Flavio. I was thinking about Kayla as well.
Kayla's another good example.
They're great in judo and they have jiu-jitsu support, and then look what they did, right? And then if you think about in jiu-jitsu, like Rodolfo, Bochecha, Gordon, even Roger had standing. So
Roger's got pretty good
if you have the standing, it's a huge plus, you know, like so.
It's a big tactical advantage.
Yeah.
And again, you just have to be creative in finding situations to use it.
Yeah.
Like there's always going to be, in a 10-minute match, there's going to be some point where you're standing.
I agree.
Okay, it may not even be at the start of the match. It might be the other guy runs out, pulls guard, but at some point there's going to be some action where you come back up to the feet.
Even to finish sweeps.
Yep. 100%.
You need to take those many times.
100%. A lot of times guys scramble out of sweeps and now you're both standing. And then there's going to be an opportunity. 10 minutes is a long time. And in that time, even if it starts with a guard pull, there's going to be some times where you get to exhibit your standing skills. These are not, some skills where you're never going to get to use them.
No, okay? I agree 100%, John. John, and what's the practical goal of the first instruction you're doing, the volume 1?
I actually have a very distinct goal. I think a lot of jiu-jitsu players have a fear that the standing game is like this bottomless pit that's going to draw their training time and distract them from the primary goal of jiu-jitsu, which is to master the ground positions. Okay, let's imagine, Bernardo, you're a working person. You may only have time for 2 jiu-jitsu sessions a week. You know that 90% of matches in jiu-jitsu are won on the floor. The vast majority of points scored are on the floor. The vast majority of submission entries occur on the floor. It's natural you're going to want to think, okay, that's where I should be devoting most of my training time. Then you start learning some standing skills, and you're like, wow, there's a lot of things to learn here. There's a lot of skills. It's a deep ocean of moves. You study wrestling and judo, and you're like, man, they got just as many moves as jiu-jitsu does, and there's a lot of skills for me to learn. And you might be concerned, saying, like, if I swallow up half of my training time with standing position, it's going to eat into my ground training. And this might have a serious effect on my ability to defend myself down on the floor against someone who exclusively focuses on the ground. If you've got limited training time, you're probably going to want to devote most of it to the most important part of the sport, which is the floor. Okay, so there's a natural fear, I think, that a lot of jiu-jitsu players have that, okay, if there's a lot of skills I had to learn in the standing position, how am I ever going to have time to do it? My goal, my practical goal for Volume 1 is to get jiu-jitsu students scoring in the standing position against someone their own size and their own skill level within 3 to 6 months. Okay, I say that not as a bold claim to sell a video, but as the practical experience of my 25 to 30 years of coaching. It's my earnest belief that you can take someone who started off the sport of jiu-jitsu and get them scoring confidently and successfully against someone their own size and their own skill level in 3 to 6 months. I've done it so many times I've lost count. Okay? Now, in order to do that, you need to have a very special curriculum. Many of the most well-known standing skills, takedowns in particular, are long-term projects. Okay, if I'm going to teach someone how to throw with uchimata or a standing taitoshi, these are complex skills and they are long-term projects. It's going to take you a long time to get good at, say, for example, a hopping ken-ken uchimata on a tough opponent your own size and skill level. There's a lot of balance requirement. There's a lot of balance breaking requirements. There's a lot of gripping skills required. You can do it, but it's
a lot of counterattacks.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of counters to it. And even if you do get good at it, you might only succeed with a certain percentage of the takedowns. I'll talk about that later when we talk about specialized judo takedowns. So that's a long-term project. Now, it's a good project, it's a great project, and I'm happy if someone engages in it. But it's going to take you a while. You're not going to learn to throw someone with a high amplitude upper body throw, a uchimata or taitoshi or harai goshi or something like this in 3 to 6 months. Not going to happen. Okay, but there are other takedowns which take considerably less skill and which people can realistically start taking people down in that 3 to 6 month time frame. For example, I spend a lot of time in Volume 1 looking at things like collar drags and ankle picks. Now, these are not particularly difficult skills to learn, and they have something which I'm going to talk about now. There are certain takedowns in the sport of jiu-jitsu and other grappling arts which have a tremendous overlap with the ground positions. Okay, let me talk about this in some detail because it's important for the video. There are some takedowns which work both as sweeps on the ground and as takedowns in the standing position. I'll give you an example, a collar drag, okay?
Yep.
A collar drag is a highly effective sweep from open guard position.
Butterfly, yeah.
Someone grabs your legs in butterfly guard, boom, down he goes, okay? It's a great sweep. It's also a highly effective takedown in the standing position. An ankle pick is a highly effective way to sweep someone from open guard. You can come up from open guard, boom, take an ankle, put them down. And it's also a highly effective move from the standing situation. Tomoe nage, the overhead throw, is an excellent sweep from open guard. Someone standing on top of you, tomoe nage, over the top, 2 points, sweep, beautiful. It's also an amazingly effective takedown from the standing position. My point is there are certain takedowns which can be very effective both on the floor, where you train every day in jiu-jitsu, and in the standing position. And with minimum modifications, you can take someone who's already pretty good at lapel drags, ankle picks, tomoe nage, sumigeshi, which they use every day down on the ground and have been for a long time now, and easily get people to translate those skills to the standing position. Now, jiu-jitsu players spend all day working in open guard. They're using tomoe nage sweeps, sumigeshis, ankle picks all the time. It's not asking a lot to get them to apply those same moves in the standing position. And in that kind of time frame, takedowns that have a high overlap between the ground and the standing situation are easy for jiu-jitsu players to learn. And realistically, they can start using them in a very short time frame against someone their own size and their own skill level. Of this, I have absolute confidence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, John, because, for example, when you would ever use Uchimata on the ground? It doesn't
almost never.
make any sense.
There are some situations where you have a whizzer, they have a tight waist grip, and from a scramble situation, you might lever them down using like a half Uchimata, but it's not a true Uchimata. Drop Seyanagi.
Yeah, but those type of
takedowns like drop Seyanagi, you're never going to use them on the ground.
Yeah, but those type of takedowns like lapel drag, you use that on the ground all the time.
Guy Toriando passes you, lapel drag, boom.
Ankle peek too. You're playing guard, you grab it.
You sit up, take an ankle, put them down. These are things we use all the time. It's not asking a lot to take students who are already using these for years and say, listen, let's start using these in the standing position. They're already good at them on the ground. Why can't they just make minimum modifications, a few simple notions about stance, gripping, positioning, breaking of balance, which are not difficult skills to learn for these particular moves. And before you know it, they're taking people down confidently.
No, and John, I'm a huge believer of the overlap as a concept in life. Because, for example, let's say you learn something 70%. To leave this aside and go learn something else from 0 to 7, it's hard. But if you can keep practicing this and overlap over here, the process might be much easier.
Volume 1, one of the big features of Volume 1 is the use of overlap takedowns. As much as possible, I try to incorporate overlap takedowns. The two most obvious examples are going to be collar drags and ankle picks, which have a huge overlap. In subsequent videos, I'm going to be looking extensively at tomoe-nage, sumigeshi, and other overlap takedowns, where there's, as we just said, a considerable overlap between ground, which jiu-jitsu players are very familiar with and usually extremely good at, and standing position. And it's much easier for jiu-jitsu players to take these well-developed skills on the floor and translate them to the standing position, where, as you said, Bernardo, they already have 70% of it already mastered. It's not hard for them to learn the remaining 30%. But if you start with something like drop Seyanagi,
you can stop practicing this.
You're starting at the bottom, and not for nothing, but that's a much more difficult skill to learn.
No, I agree.
It's not just because you're starting from at the bottom. You're learning skills that have no equivalent in jiu-jitsu. Like, you got to learn how to turn your body 180 degrees in front of your opponent and expose your back to your opponent and throw them. We're taught from day one never to expose our back to our opponent. Now suddenly you're being taught to do it in order to throw someone. It's a hard one for jiu-jitsu players to get around.
And also, like, you're adding up on your skills, right? So you already know this. It would be almost the same thing to take on engineering and ask him to become a doctor. But if you ask him to do something related to math, it might be much easier, right? Because there is the overlap. That makes sense, John.
So the theme of overlap takedowns is an important throughout the feet to floor series, and it really becomes important in Volume 1. Because the truth is, if we all ask ourselves as jiu-jitsu students out there watching this video, your experience in jiu-jitsu is probably the same as mine was, and the same as yours were. But when we were white belts and blue belts, we were pretty nervous about takedowns, to be honest with you. It was like it was unknown territory, it was uncharted territory, and you kind of like, when we have to do standing position, it was like, oh my God, well, what am I going to do here? Like, and most people just come out and just pull guard. My goal is to get people watching this video to get people scoring confidently, as I said, on someone their own size and skill level in 3 to 6 months. And based on my coaching experience over between 20 and 30 years, I've been able to do this in many, many occasions. It's a very doable goal. Those are not just empty numbers I'm throwing at you. Those are numbers based on my experience as a coach. And it's not, I'm not just pulling these numbers out of thin air. They're what I observe in training on a regular basis. And if we pay particular attention to the overlap principle, I believe this can be done for people watching these videos too.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, John. So, John, in your opinion, what's wrong with the current jiu-jitsu standing game?
I believe there are 3 major problems with the current state of the standing game in jiu-jitsu. The first major problem that jiu-jitsu players face is a motivational problem. Okay, what is the motivational problem with standing game? The truth is, you can be a world champion in jiu-jitsu without knowing a single takedown. That's just the facts. Okay, there are world champions out there who have almost no standing skills. So there's an obvious question. Okay, if I don't need them, why should I learn them? Okay,
that makes sense.
we have partially answered that, which is the idea that, well, those who do have the skills have found creative ways to incorporate them and win matches with them. But that begs the question, well, what about the other guys who didn't have any standing skills and they became champions nonetheless? Okay, so admittedly, there is a motivational problem. That's the first major problem that we encounter with the current standing game. That if you look around you, you can honestly say that takedowns are not essential to becoming a champion in jiu-jitsu. Related to this is the idea that many students have a fear that they could spend huge amounts of time training the standing position and just never get an opportunity to use it. Let's say, for example, you spend 10 years developing a powerful drop Seanagi, a beautiful Uchimata, and a devastating Taitoshi. Then you use them a couple of times in competition, everyone sees it, and they're like, oh, that guy's good at takedowns. Yeah. Just pull guard on him.
Yeah.
And so now you never get a chance to use them again. You just invested 10 years of your life, and now you never get to use them again. Okay, so that's kind of heartbreaking. There's a sense in which jiu-jitsu is unusual amongst grappling arts, that if someone pulls guard on you, you have to engage on the floor. Okay, in almost every other grappling art, that's unheard of. You can't just pull guard on someone, and if they did, if you walked away from them, you have to stand up and fight from the feet. In jiu-jitsu, I have to go down to the guy. Engage, yeah. I have to engage. I can't just walk away. And so there is this motivational problem. Okay, if you get good at takedowns, you put in the time, you put in the effort, and it's going to be a long time.
And the guy pulls guard.
And then the guy pulls guard, and you never get to use it. Now, our answer to that so far has been, well, actually, history shows that people who are good at takedowns can find creative ways to get these takedowns into a game. Okay, but you're going to have to be creative in the way you do it. Okay, if everyone just pulls guard on you, you're not going to get these opportunities. But as we said, people like Rodolfo Vieira, everyone knew he was good at takedowns. Everyone knows Buchec's got a good double leg. Everyone knows Ronaldo Jacare had a good Seanagi, but they found ways to get it to work. They found opportunities that were creative in the way they did it. I still believe in that, and I believe history backs up what we said. But there is this motivational fear. So that would be the first problem of the current state of jiu-jitsu. It's a motivational problem.
That makes complete sense, John.
Now, Bernardo, if the motivational problem is the first problem, I would say the second problem of the current state of standing game in jiu-jitsu, it's a coaching problem. If you look at the way takedowns are typically taught in jiu-jitsu, you will see that there is a real problem with what I call the fragmental fallacy, or the fragment fallacy. This is the idea that in jiu-jitsu, takedowns are taught as an isolated skill, a fragment of the overall standing position. If you go into your average jiu-jitsu class, what you'll typically see is at the beginning of class, instructors will be, okay guys, here's a takedown. And they teach it, and then they move on to the ground, which is the serious part of class, and then they go to work. And so all they got taught was the takedown itself. Okay, there's no discussion of the skills required to get that takedown to work. It's just the takedown got taught. Now, Bernardo, if I came up to a beginning student and I said, okay, here's an armbar, and I took that student and I made them drill just the armbar for 6 months, every day, hours a day, and they just drilled the armbar. Okay, the only skill they had was just that armbar. And now I bring them into your class and I say, okay kid, you know what an armbar is? And I point at you and I say, go armbar that guy. Do you think he's going to be able to armbar you?
Yeah.
No, he's not even going to get close. Why? Because he doesn't have any other skills
to get to the armbar.
Okay. In order to manifest a skill in combat sports, you have to have that skill embedded in many other skills that get you in a position to actually exhibit the skill. And this is a very obvious point. And yet, for some reason, this doesn't translate into our coaching of takedowns in jiu-jitsu. Guys just come in and say, okay guys, here's an osotogari. And they teach the osotogari. Okay, you learn that, you're good. Now, when you drill the osotogari, your training partner is not resisting you, so it feels pretty easy, and you think to yourself, hey, I'm pretty good at this osotogari, and it feels pretty natural. Then you go into a sparring situation, and you're like, oh my God, this is impossible. I can't even get this move to work at all. I can't even get close to it. And it's because you don't have any other skills. All you've got is a kind of limited knowledge of a given move. You don't have any skills in which it's embedded that get you to the position to do it.
Yep.
You can't learn jiu-jitsu in fragments. You have to learn the whole thing. This is true for any combat sport. And I hate to say it, but the way takedowns are coached in jiu-jitsu falls in line with the fragment fallacy. People get taught fragments of standing skills. Here's a takedown. Here's another takedown. Like, okay, that's great, but how do I get in a position to actually do any of this stuff? And that's just completely ignored. You can't coach along the lines of the fragment fallacy and expect your opponents, your students to start throwing people. It's not going to happen. The same way you couldn't expect someone to just learn an armbar and then go into a competitive match and armbar people. It's not going to happen. He's got to learn a whole bunch of other things. He's got to learn how to pass guard. He's got to learn the basics of stance, like how to hold himself. And there's a mountain of things he has to learn. And yet we do a good job on the floor of avoiding the fragment fallacy in jiu-jitsu, but we do a very poor job of avoiding it in the standing position.
Yep.
And that's got to change. So that would be the first aspect of the coaching problem. Now, there's a second aspect to the coaching problem, and this is what I often refer to as the add-on fallacy. Okay, if you look at the way standing position is coached in jiu-jitsu, you will see that there's a very obvious fallacy in the way that it's done. Your average jiu-jitsu coach tends to borrow moves from judo or wrestling and incorporate them into the sport of jiu-jitsu.
That's true.
Where the rules and directives are substantially different. Okay? How many times you gone into a jiu-jitsu school and you see them teaching a basic single leg takedown for jiu-jitsu classes? Okay? That's great. Single leg takedowns are a highly effective move, very effective. But they're using wrestling setups when the students are all wearing gis.
Yep.
Now, the wrestling setups work great with no gi. Now, suddenly, you got a gi on, the whole game's different.
Yep.
Like the whole gripping exchanges are different. The whole way you stand and stance and motion is completely different. You're wearing a goddamn jacket, okay? There's no jackets in wrestling. Like the hand fighting of wrestling is completely different to the grip fighting of judo. It's two different oceans. Okay? Pacific over here and Atlantic over there, they don't combine. And so you see people teaching wrestling hand fighting to set up single legs when everyone's wearing a gi. It's not going to work. It's going to be a disaster. Then you see a similar mistake. You'll say, okay, let's start borrowing from judo then. And so you'll see people take on throws that work extremely well in judo. Say, for example, drop sanagi. Okay, that's one of the most popular and effective throws in judo. Now, drop sanagi can be a devastating weapon in a jiu-jitsu match. It absolutely can be. It's a great skill. But it can also get you in a whole lot of hot water.
You can't get her back.
You're turning your back directly to your opponent.
In judo, that's not a problem, right?
In judo, the rules protect you.
Yeah.
Okay, if you screw up a drop sanagi in judo, the referee will come in and save you. If you screw up a drop sanagi in jiu-jitsu, the ref ain't going to come and save you. The match is 10 minutes long, and you have just begun the match with your opponent on your back, ready to strangle you. Okay, that is an unmitigated disaster. Okay, many of the techniques of judo are magnificent for the purposes of judo. Okay, now what is the purpose of judo? The primary purpose of judo is to score an ippon throw, which means to project your opponent onto his back with force and momentum. In jiu-jitsu, that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to exhibit control after the takedown. Okay, a beautiful driving uchimata in judo, which catapults my opponent onto his back and shoulders with force and momentum, will usually result in a roll through, where having completed the throw, I end up in the bottom position. In jiu-jitsu, that scores 0 points. Zero. And now you're underneath the guy. You wanted to get top position with a throw, now you're under him. Good luck. Match has just begun, you got 10 minutes, see you later. So the takedowns which are appropriate for the purposes of judo are very different. Even the grip fighting sequences for judo are designed primarily to stop the other person throwing you with force and momentum while allowing you to throw them. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, there are many grips appropriate for, say, guard pulling, which have nothing to do with stopping someone from throwing you. So even the grip fighting exchanges are different in jiu-jitsu. They've got different purposes, different directions. And so what you tend to get is most people just take a few skills from judo, wrestling, even sambo, and just add them on to jiu-jitsu. And, okay, guys, let's see what happens. Well, it can work. These are magnificent arts. No one loves judo and wrestling and sambo more than me. I'll sit down with a popcorn and a Coke and I'll watch judo and wrestling highlights all day. I love it, okay? But I'm also cognizant of the fact that a lot of the stuff they do can get you on hot water in jiu-jitsu, okay? And it can backfire pretty damn badly. So what we need to do is make damn sure, if we're going to add things on from other grappling sports, we've got to be smart how we do this. It can't just be like, okay, drop Sanagi, that looks cool. I saw that in a highlight reel from a judo clip. Let me bring that in, okay? We've got to be careful what we select. And we need to be tactically aware, is this appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu? Because it's a damn different sport. And this add-on fallacy needs to be guarded against. We've got to be careful what we add on. And it's got to be appropriate for the unique elements of jiu-jitsu. Now, I promise you, Bernardo, we'll talk more about what are the unique elements of jiu-jitsu soon. But this will be what I believe is the second major problem with the current state of jiu-jitsu standing position, the coaching problem. Okay?
No, that makes a lot of sense, John.
Yeah. Now, Bernardo, we've talked about the motivational problem. We've talked about the coaching problem. I would also say there is a third problem with the current state of standing game in jiu-jitsu. That's a training problem. If you look at most schools in jiu-jitsu, there is a huge disproportion between the amount of time invested in ground training versus standing training. Okay, most schools and most coaches tend to treat the standing position as a warm-up. Okay, class begins, you practice a couple of takedowns, and then you get into the serious part of class, which is the ground. And this is even more so with sparring time. Okay, the vast majority of schools, there is no sparring time in the standing position. And then when a competition comes up, you get a group of people together and say, hey, we're going into a competition, match starts standing, what are we going to do? They've got 2 weeks, and they look at each other and they're like, let's just pull guard.
Yeah, and I see that happen all the time, John, and I feel even sorry when the guy is ultra heavy, for example. Yeah. Because he can't pull guard, you know, like, and then he doesn't know what to do when he's standing. And he's pretty tough, but he's tough on top. But how he's going to get on top?
How's he going to practice this? Yeah. It's so I would say training time is the third big problem that jiu-jitsu players face. And also, Bernardo, there's a practical element here that we have to add in. Jiu-jitsu around the world is a club sport. Okay, now let's compare that with wrestling and judo. Wrestling and judo are Olympic sports. Okay, and many of the people with Olympic aspirations started training when they were 5. They began as children and they grew up performing the sport. Many of them in judo, for example, in Japan and Korea, they go through college playing judo. In the United States, they go through college wrestling. These are highly competitive academic programs, and they have a giant squad of people. If someone gets injured, tough luck. You bring in the second guy and he replaces the first guy. Yep. Okay? You can't have that attitude with a club sport. In a club sport, people come in and they pay money to train. You can't just, when someone gets injured, say, well, tough luck, see you later, I'll replace you now. You can't run a business that way. Moreover, many of the students that we teach are people who started late in life. I started jiu-jitsu when I was 28 years old. Okay, I started jiu-jitsu 28 years old with a crippled leg. For most people, it'd be pretty tough for them under those circumstances to suddenly start learning a hopping uchimata, a driving taitoshi, or a flawless haraigoshi throw. Okay, especially if you're only training that for a limited amount of time a week. So there are practical reasons why training time has to be a little bit lower. I'll give you an example. When you go to Japan and you see the competitive judo schools, especially the university judo schools, that's where most of the best athletes work out. You will see that among the young university athletes, the majority of training time, the vast majority of training time is done in the standing position. Okay, that's because they're all 19 to 21 years old. And as young athletes who have been training since they're 5 years old, it's natural for them to focus on the part of the sport which is most likely to bring you victory, which is standing throws. But when you go to other judo schools in Japan, where they're not college age anymore, let's say, for example, you go to the Tokyo Police Department and you work out in their dojo, the average age there is like 35 to 45. 90% of their training is on the ground, what the Japanese call newaza. They don't do a lot of throwing practice there because they're 45 years old.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, when you're 45 years old, getting thrown 300 times a day, it's not good for your body. It's not fun anymore. Okay, now when you're 19, it's not a problem. If you started when you're 5 years old, you're used to it. It's not a problem. What about a guy who started when he's 33?
Yeah, I agree.
And now he just wants to do this recreationally.
I agree.
Now you're telling this guy, okay, you got to take it 50 hard throws every day. Like, they're looking at you like, are you kidding me? Like, dude, I'm 35 years old. I got a wife and kids. Yeah, I got to go to work tomorrow. You can't train high amplitude throws with people like this. Okay, it's unlikely someone who starts at the age of 37 is going to learn a flawless drop sanagi. Okay, it can be done. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's the majority of people starting at this age. It's not really practical to start them off with like a hard driving Olympic level drop sanagi. It's probably not going to happen. That's something typically when you start much younger in life. But someone like this can easily learn, for example, a collar drag. Yep. That's a very doable goal for them. So there's a sense in which jiu-jitsu has pretty unique elements with regards to training time. It's a club sport. It's not an academic sport. It's not an Olympic competitive sport in that sense. Most of the athletes tend to start much later in life, and most of them play as part of a club where they join and it's a little more informal, as opposed to like wrestling for Iowa, where there's a lot of you. If you're not performing, tough luck, kid, get the fuck out. Okay, we can replace you in 5 minutes. There's 5 other guys who want your spot. Okay, it's a different environment. Now, that's the best environment for producing competitive athletes. Okay, nothing gets people competitive like competition just to get on the spot for the wrestling team. When there's 5 other guys who want your spot, you're going to train pretty hard. So as coaches, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this is a club sport, and we have to build people through a different culture than we would if we were coaching a Japanese judo university or an American wrestling university team. It's a different thing. So those are the 3 main problems that I see a coach in jiu-jitsu when it comes time to teaching the standing game. There's the motivational problem, there's the coaching problem, and there's the training time problem. How much time are we investing in standing position, given that it's mostly a game which is won on the ground? And our ability to create an effective standing program with the feet to floor series is going to come down to our ability to deal with these 3 problems.
No, I agree, John. And everything you were saying, like, I think this is kind of like the beauty of jiu-jitsu, right? That people can start old in life and they still not get hurt or still be a good hobby to have. So makes a lot of sense that the takedowns that they should be practicing are the ones that doesn't exposure them that much. So, John, now knowing the problems, what do you think we should do to solve that?
I think everything begins with all of us as coaches of jiu-jitsu taking a hard look at what are the unique aspects of jiu-jitsu that differentiate it from other grappling games in the standing position. When you look at the sport of jiu-jitsu in the standing position, you see that there are substantial differences between the other great grappling arts that stand alongside jiu-jitsu, judo, wrestling, sambo, and et cetera, et cetera. Let's start looking at some of those differences. I'm going to start with an obvious one. If you look at judo, sambo, and wrestling, amplitude in a takedown counts for a lot. In judo, it actually counts for everything. When we talk about the amplitude of a takedown, that's the degree of force and height achieved in a given takedown. Wrestling and judo in particular, but most other grappling styles as well, reward amplitude. The bigger and more powerful the throw, the more you score. The weaker and less powerful the throw, the less you score. Okay, so in judo, they have the notion of an ippon throw. That's the maximum score. That's like their version of like a knockout punch. Okay, you throw someone hard, flat on their back, with force and projection, it's over, it's done. Okay, in wrestling, they have grades of points for throws. Okay, you can score a takedown, which scores in international freestyle wrestling. Currently, it scores 2. You can have a 3-point takedown with his certain criteria are met, and you can have a 5-point takedown. That's where the feet go higher than the hips and shoulders, and you drop the guy down with force and projection with his back towards the floor. And so you see that takedowns are graded according to the amount of amplitude that they express. In jiu-jitsu, no reward for amplitude. There's 0 reward for amplitude. The smallest takedown in jiu-jitsu scores the same as the biggest takedown. If Bernardo picked me up and slammed me flat on my back with a beautiful takedown, he scores 2 points. If Bernardo trips my ankle and I fall gently on my butt, it's the same, 2 points. Okay? So jiu-jitsu does not reward amplitude. Every takedown scores the same. They're all 2 points. Second key difference. Most grappling styles reward risk. Okay, if you look at wrestling, you look at judo, they want you to take risks for a big throw. The rules push you towards risk. You can turn your back on someone in judo and make a big attempt at a throw, and if it fails, the rules will protect you. The referee will protect you. Okay, if I screw up an ippon sanagi in a judo match and I fall to my knees in front of my opponent, he jumps on my back and gets his hooks in, how many points does he score? 0. Nothing. Not a thing, not a dime. Okay? In jiu-jitsu, he scores 4 points. And now he's in a position to finish me. If I screw up a throw, I just have to protect myself belly down for 3 to 4 seconds and I'm fine. In jiu-jitsu, the ref's not going to come and help you. You put your belly down in jiu-jitsu, you're in big trouble. You're in big trouble, okay? So wrestling and judo, and to a lesser degree sambo, protect you for taking risks. Jiu-jitsu punishes risk, okay? The whole idea of jiu-jitsu is to punish risk. They want you to play a conservative game that gets you into dominant positions on the ground, in particular the mounted position and the rear mounted position. They're not looking for risk-taking maneuvers where you expose your back to your opponent. If you take risks in jiu-jitsu with position, you will be severely punished, and no one's going to come to help you. The ref's is going to look at you and be like, yep, dig yourself out of that grave. Okay, so there is a fundamental difference between the standing position in jiu-jitsu, which severely punishes risk, versus judo and sambo and wrestling, which actively promote risk in the effort to get you throwing big, high-amplitude throws. Okay, so that's one of the biggest differences between jiu-jitsu and the standing position and all the other grappling styles.
No, that makes a lot of sense, John. And I think this makes much harder for everybody to learn, right? Because you want to learn how to take someone down, but you also don't expose your back or something like that. So then you ended up going to the easiest takedowns to learn. So the lapel drag, that was great.
Now, Bernardo, I would say the third biggest difference between jiu-jitsu and the standing position and all the other great grappling styles of the world is that in jiu-jitsu, we only value the outcome of a takedown. In judo, the takedown itself is what is valued. Okay, it's the takedown that has the value. Same in wrestling. In jiu-jitsu, only the outcome of the takedown is valued. It's how you finish after the takedown that counts.
Yeah, because that makes a lot of sense, John. Because if the person doesn't stay 3 seconds in the ground, you don't even get the points.
Now, that 3-second rule doesn't get a lot of discussion in jiu-jitsu, but it has the deepest significance for the standing position in jiu-jitsu. In order to score in jiu-jitsu, you got to hold them down on their side, their back, or their butt for 3 seconds. Now, Bernardo, you know this better than anyone else. In a fight, 3 seconds is an eternity. It's a long, long time.
Especially when you're...
Like, it's not easy to hold someone down for 3 seconds immediately after a takedown when both of you are kind of unstable. 3 seconds, I'll say this again, it's very important. 3 seconds in a fight is a freaking eternity. And it's not easy to score under those conditions. Now, in judo and wrestling, it's the takedown itself which is valued. And so, let's say, for example, in wrestling, if I snap someone down to the ground and I go behind them, all I have to do is touch their knee on the floor and I score. In jiu-jitsu, I got to touch their knee on the floor and hold it there for 3 freaking seconds. That's hard. That's not easy at all. Okay. If I throw someone, I got to make sure that they stay down, either on their back or if they turn to their belly with one knee on the floor, 3 seconds. And this is not an easy set of conditions to fulfill.
And another thing, like the mat size in jiu-jitsu is much smaller than in judo and wrestling, especially when it's not the finals or the semifinals. So on those 3 seconds, the guy can
go out of bounds,
run away, and then you start standing again. So.
Now, ostensibly, you're not supposed to flee the mat like that, but there's ways to disguise it. You
can play in the corners.
Absolutely. There's definitely ways to do this. So scoring, it's not easy. Always remember, guys, in jiu-jitsu, it's the outcome of the takedown which is valued. I'll say it to you this way. Jiu-jitsu doesn't care about the takedown. Jiu-jitsu cares about what happens 3 seconds after the takedown. That's what jiu-jitsu cares about. In judo, your back touches the ground with force and impact, boom, it's over. Good night. You're out. Okay? In jiu-jitsu, that's where things start. Your back touches the ground, now there's 3 seconds, and we're going to see where things finish. And at the end of those 3 seconds, that's what counts. So I'll say it to you again. One of the biggest differences between jiu-jitsu and the other standing grappling arts is the idea that it's the outcome of the takedown. Specifically, 3 seconds after the takedown occurs, that's what's valued, not the takedown itself. And this strongly differentiates jiu-jitsu in the standing position from the other grappling arts.
Yeah, no, that was a great point, John.
Now, Bernardo, the fourth great difference between jiu-jitsu and in particular judo is the idea that there is a whole category of takedowns in jiu-jitsu that don't even occur in judo. These are takedowns where you take someone down to a prone position on their hands and knees. In judo, if I throw someone down to their hands and knees, it doesn't score anything. It's 0. In jiu-jitsu, that scores 2 points, the same as a takedown where you throw them on their back. You just got to hold their knees down on the floor, at least one knee, for 3 seconds. But there is a whole category of takedowns in jiu-jitsu that don't even exist in judo. Like, it's substantially different. Jiu-jitsu has 2 forms of takedowns. Front takedowns, where I face my opponent and I throw him usually towards his back, and takedowns where we're chest to back when we begin, where I'm behind my opponent and I take him down to his hands and knees. So this whole second category of takedowns don't even exist in the sport of judo, but we as jiu-jitsu students must be highly competent in these. They score the same points and they occur just as often. And so this is another important way in which jiu-jitsu differentiates from other grappling styles, judo in particular.
No, that makes sense. So John, if that's how jiu-jitsu is different, what do you think we need to go forward?
I think one of the first things we need is the idea of a strong curriculum expressly designed or appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu. Okay, I have a simple way of grading the degree to which a takedown is appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu. As you probably guess, it has nothing to do with amplitude, because amplitude is not rewarded in the sport of jiu-jitsu. As I said earlier, the smallest takedown scores exactly the same as the biggest takedown. So the way in which I grade how appropriate a takedown is for the sport of jiu-jitsu comes down to a range of factors. The first is back exposure. The more a takedown exposes my back to an opponent, the more reluctant I'm going to be to use it in competition. Okay. The second will be neck exposure. If I get myself into takedowns where my neck is exposed to strangles from the front, that's never a good thing, and I'm always concerned about this. So back exposure and neck exposure are a big deal. Another form of exposure which people don't talk about, which is very important for jiu-jitsu purposes, is belt exposure. In jiu-jitsu, you're wearing a belt. Okay, many takedowns which are common in wrestling, single legs, double legs, etc., make it very easy for an opponent to reach over the top and get a hold of your belt. Now, a belt grip is a very powerful throwing grip. And common moves in jiu-jitsu, such as a single leg, can be very strongly countered with uchimata or sumigeshi with a belt grip. So you've got to be careful about how much you expose your belt as an opponent reaches over your back and gets to your belt in the sport of jiu-jitsu. So these are real problems for the jiu-jitsu athlete. How much back exposure do we generate? How much neck exposure to guillotines, etc., to loop strangles do I generate with a given takedown? How much belt exposure do I generate? Another big problem for jiu-jitsu athletes is roll-through exposure. What is a roll-through? That's where I hit a high-amplitude throw, usually in a forwards direction, and the amplitude of the throw is such that when I hit my opponent, he grabs me and physically rolls me through. So I threw him flat on his back, but the net outcome of the takedown is me in bottom position. Okay,
Yep.
you throw someone hard with a good uchimata, there's a very good chance you're going to get rolled through. And so you threw the guy. Under judo rules, you would have won the match. But in jiu-jitsu rules, you literally score nothing. You're underneath the guy, the outcome of the throw. And this is kind of upsetting. You hit what seems to be a beautiful, picture-perfect throw that would have scored you huge points in wrestling and would have won you the match in judo, and you find yourself with nothing, and now the match has barely begun and you're underneath your opponent. Okay, he might even be side control on you at this point. This is kind of upsetting. So the first criteria I look at in judging how appropriate is a takedown for the sport of jiu-jitsu, how much back exposure does it generate? Because if there's one unforgivable sin in jiu-jitsu, is back exposure. You can't expose your back to your opponent. Okay, that's the easiest way to get scored on in the sport. Okay, so you want to limit back exposure. You want to limit neck exposure. I don't want to put my neck right into a guillotine or a loop strangle. Okay, going for a single leg. You got to be careful with this. Now, I'm not criticizing single legs. I think they're an important part of a jiu-jitsu curriculum, but you need to be aware that there is this problem of neck exposure there. Belt exposure. I can't just give easy access to my belt to an opponent and be naive about this. Now, again, there are some takedowns more than others that expose your belt to your opponent. Single leg's an obvious example. And then there's this idea of roll-through exposure. There are many high-amplitude takedowns that set you up to be rolled through, and then in jiu-jitsu you don't score anything with that. So those are the criteria that I use to grade how appropriate is a given takedown for the sport of jiu-jitsu. And if you look at some of the takedowns that we specialize with in this first volume of feet to floor, you'll see, for example, that a collar drag has no back exposure.
Yep.
There's zero back exposure.
Yep.
You will see that it has zero neck exposure. If you hit a collar drag, there's no guillotine counter to it. There's no loop strangle counter to it. It's not even there. It's not even
Yep.
available. There's no belt exposure. You can't
Yep.
grab my belt when I try to do it. And there's no roll-through exposure. Like a
That
collar
makes a lot
drag,
of
there's
sense.
zero roll. So this would be an example of something which is highly appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, I always like the collar drag a lot because even if you fail, you don't end up in a bad spot.
Exactly.
You end up probably
Yeah.
with the guy on your half guard
Exactly. Yeah.
or something like
Now
that.
we talk about this with the ankle pick, Kabisugeshi, same thing. When you go into an ankle pick, zero back exposure. There's
Yep.
no neck exposure. At no point does your neck go through underneath your opponent's arm and get exposed to a loop strangle or a guillotine or anything like this. There's no belt exposure. You're controlling your opponent's body at the length of your arm. You can't reach over your back and get to your belt. There's no roll-through exposure. The amplitude of an ankle pick is so low that there's no danger of being rolled through. And so these two takedowns score very high
Yep.
on my criteria for are they appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu. There are others, sumigeshi and tomoe-nage, which we'll be looking at a lot in the second volume of the Feet to Floor series. Again,
Zero exposure.
zero
Yep.
exposure of back, zero exposure of belt, zero exposure of neck, very little danger of roll-through. In fact, if there is any roll-through in those cases, it's going to be in your favor.
Yeah.
So these are highly appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu. Then you'll look at a throw like drop seoi-nage, which has huge back exposure.
Yeah.
That's a big strike against it. No neck exposure, but a lot of back exposure. Okay. So this, I'm not going to say it's wrong to use it. It can be an effective part of your game, but you're going to have to be very smart about your applications, and you're going to have to be confident in your throwing skills to use it. This is not one where if you don't have...
Yeah, it's the long-term project.
Yeah, it's a long-term project. You can do it in the long term, but you're not going to learn this in 3 to 6 months.
No,
okay?
I agree.
And the idea behind Volume 1 is we want you getting out there and scoring in 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
And so I've been very careful in the takedowns that I selected for this first volume.
No, that's awesome, John.
Yeah. Now, there are a couple of other criteria that I look at with regards to takedown selection, and this you've probably guessed from what we said earlier in the interview, Bernardo. This is the idea of investment time. There are some takedowns which are incredibly beautiful and effective takedowns, but they're going to take you a long time to learn.
Yeah.
Okay, like a good Uchimata or a good standing Tai Toshi, it's going to take you a while. They're beautiful takedowns. No one likes to see them more in operation than me. But the learning curve on them it's a difficult thing to get them to work quickly. And as we said, these are more your long-term projects.
Yeah.
And it's understandable, as we said earlier, that students might be reluctant if they have limited amounts of time to train to invest a lot of time in these. So this is another criteria that I look at. How much time and how much bang for the buck am I going to get for my training time? Collar drag takes very little time to get good at, and you're going to get a lot of bang for the buck.
Yeah.
As opposed to Uchimata, where it's going to take you a long time to get good. You might not get that many opportunities for it. And once you get a reputation as being good for it, people are going to pull guard on you a lot. So you don't get as many opportunities as you'd like. So I'm always looking for that training or investment in training time. How much bang for the buck do you get with these takedowns? And you tend to see that some offer more bang for the buck than the others. So when I look to select takedowns for the feet to floor video series, I always look for those which offer the minimum of back exposure, neck exposure, belt exposure, roll through exposure, and maximize your bang for buck. How much you're going to get in the training time available. How often are you going to be able to use these? And there we use the concept of overlap. Okay. Yeah. If I'm using takedowns, which I use on the floor already all the time, like tomonagi, sumigeshi, ankle picks, collar drags, it's not going to take me a lot of training time to get good at them in the standing position. So that's the first thing that we need if we're going to make forward progress with jiu-jitsu standing position. Get a good curriculum. Have a set of criteria which we can use to judge how appropriate is this takedown for jiu-jitsu competition. I've given you a bunch of very clear criteria. Those are the criteria I use. I use them in the feet to floor series.
Yep.
And I believe in this way we can start building a solid jiu-jitsu curriculum which guides students in the appropriate directions.
No, that's awesome. And I agree 100% with everything you said.
The first thing we need, if we're going to make forward progress in the standing position in jiu-jitsu, is a curriculum. What's the second thing we need? Well, you've probably guessed from what I said earlier, Bernardo. We need to start teaching the precursor skills to takedowns. We have to avoid the fragment fallacy. You can't just teach takedowns. You have to teach the skills that get you to the takedowns. Yeah. Okay? In particular, students need to be taught stance. Okay, they've got to understand there are different stances. Some of the stances that are appropriate for other grappling sports are not always appropriate for jiu-jitsu. Okay, students must become familiar with the idea of the appropriate stance for jiu-jitsu purposes. They must be familiar with the idea of gripping. If you can't grip effectively, you can't throw anybody. You can't even pull guard or pull guard in ways which are creative and interesting. You've got to be strong at stance. You've got to have strong gripping. Thirdly, you've got to be able to move yourself, and you've got to be able to move your opponent. You've got to have motion skills. If you can't move your opponent and move yourself appropriately and move with a sense of purpose, you're not going to throw anybody. Okay? We've got to get students able to get to a strong stance, get an effective grip on their opponent that offers some measure of advantage. Okay? It's hard to throw people from neutral grips. But if you get a dominant grip, it's a lot easier to start throwing people. They have to be able to move with a sense of purpose. Fourthly, they have to be able to break their opponent's stance and balance. If your opponent's in good balance and has a strong stance, it's awfully, awfully difficult to throw them. If you can break their balance and break their stance, it's a lot easier. And then fifth, They have to be able to get into a good position to throw people. Jiu-jitsu players use the notion of position all the time on the floor. It's completely natural for them. They have to learn that the notion of position occurs in the standing game just as much as it does on the floor. Just as even beginner students in jiu-jitsu know they're supposed to pass their opponent's guard and get to positions like the mount and the rear mount, that's perfectly natural for them. They have to understand there are certain positions they can get to in the standing game where it's a lot easier to throw people than it is if I just throw from wherever I am.
Okay.
So we got to get students working with these precursor skills, the skills that make takedowns possible. And if you don't have these skills, it's going to be really tough for you to take anybody down, even a white belt.
Okay. Especially in jiu-jitsu, because I think in judo, for example, you gotta have your posture. If not, you got penalty.
Yeah.
If you stay like this, and in jiu-jitsu you can stay like
you
this.
You can stay that as long as you want.
Yeah.
Think about grip. In judo, there are certain grips that I can only hold for a few seconds.
Yep.
And if I don't use
like
them immediately,
both hands in the collar, for example.
You got 1, 2, 3 seconds with that grip. And then if you haven't done something, you get penalized.
Yeah.
And jiu-jitsu, you can hold that grip for the whole match if you want.
Yeah.
So the whole set of rules and strictures with regards to stance and gripping is completely different in jiu-jitsu.
Yep.
And only when students become strong at the precursor skills of stance, grip, motion, breaking their opponent's balance, and getting to a good throwing position will they actually be able to throw someone in a competitive situation. I can go to any jiu-jitsu school in the country and I can point to many students who are perfectly good at drilling a takedown. They can show me a nice little Asotogari drill. They can do a nice Uchimata drill, and it looks pretty. But then when you ask them to actually throw someone in a competitive situation, they can't do anything. Okay? Yep. The world's full of people like that. We need to get people practicing the precursor skills so they can actually get to use in a practical competitive situation the takedowns that they practice. As we said earlier, Bernardo, it doesn't help to drill arm bars if that's all you drill.
Yeah, okay.
You need a lot more skills than that to get an armbar to work in a competitive situation. Only when we embed our takedowns in the precursor skills of stance, grip, motion, breaking your opponent's balance, and getting to a throwing position, only then are you actually going to throw someone who doesn't want to be thrown.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%, John.
Now, Bernardo, the third thing that I think that jiu-jitsu has to do going forward, if we're going to improve the performance of students in the standing position, is we have to make a distinction between front takedowns and back takedowns. Okay? As we said earlier, in the sport of judo, takedowns that throw your opponent into a prone position on their hands and knees score nothing. They don't even exist. It's not even a score. But in jiu-jitsu, it's a score. You hold their knee down on the floor for 3 seconds, you score the same as you would if you took them to their back from the front.
Yeah.
And so we need to teach 2 forms of takedown in jiu-jitsu. Takedowns from the front, where we throw our opponents on their back, and takedowns from the rear, where we throw them onto their hands and knees. And both must be practiced, both must be understood. Right now, if you look at jiu-jitsu, they kind of have a sense of this. They understand that there are takedowns from the back and some from the front, but this needs to be really clearly outlined. And we need to have a curriculum of throws from the front and throws from the back. And once people understand that there's this whole category of takedowns out there which has largely been ignored in jiu-jitsu instruction and which are perfectly capable of scoring big points. And let's be honest, Bernardo, it's a lot easier to throw someone when you're behind them than it is when you're in front of them. Yeah, let's be honest about that, okay? So if we can get students getting behind people and hitting these rare takedowns, they're going to suddenly find it's a lot easier to score points in the standing position than it is from when you're in front of someone battling it out chest to chest. So jiu-jitsu needs to develop a differentiated curriculum for front takedowns and back takedowns. I believe, Bernardo, if we can do these things, we can turn jiu-jitsu standing game around. And just as we did with leg locks, take it from very poor performance to very, very good performance in a pretty short period of time. Yeah. I believe we can do the same thing with the standing game.
No, I agree, John. And I think the videos is a huge help for that, right? Because for one instructor to learn that and teach 50 students, it's not going to help that much. But if everybody watch the videos and the entire communities learning that, that's going to be a
look
much quicker
at
path.
how the community has responded to leg lock
I
instruction.
agree.
Like every day, people send in videos to me of them winning local competitions with heel hooks,
Yeah.
and they're like, I learned this from the videos, and you're looking and go, wow, it looks just like we taught it. Like it looks like a little Gordon Ryan out there, dude, hitting this. It looks like a little Gary Tonin or Nicky Ryan. It's crazy.
No, I agree.
And the community's done an amazing job of taking video instruction, and you see people who live in the middle of America who train in a small school hitting leg locks, and you're like, wow, this is impressive. Now, why can't they do the same thing with the standing position?
Yeah, no, I believe, John. And I think we're going to see this change.
I think there'll be a change too.
Yeah.
But as I said earlier, Bernardo, I do believe that progress is possible in this fashion. And my goal is, particularly with this first volume of Feet to Floor, as I said earlier, is to get students who otherwise might have very little or even no standing skills and not even really practice it at all, confidently going against people their own size and their own skill level and scoring points in the standing position within 3 to 6 months. And I believe if we get a curriculum appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu based on the criteria that we talked about, and get people enthusiastic about this project, that this is a very, very doable goal. In volume 1, none of the takedowns require a huge investment in time. They are takedowns which have strong overlap with ground positions, and as such, many jiu-jitsu athletes already have pretty good expertise in them from groundwork, and it's not difficult for them to bring these into the standing position. And I'm very confident, based on my own coaching experience, that within that 3 to 6 month time frame, people who ordinarily don't really play the standing game much at all could be scoring consistently on people their own size and skill level in the standing game.
Oh, John, and I think we were talking about that earlier, right? Like how the way you're structuring this, for example, the higher belt is also going to need the volume 1 to understand better these basic moves. But it's going to help even more the beginners, right?
Yes.
But once the beginners understand those concepts, they will be able to learn the volume 2 as well.
That's correct.
Which you're going to go deeper.
As each volume comes out, I'm going to add progressively more technically demanding takedowns.
Yeah.
So when we get to volume 2, it's going to be a lot of work with the so-called sutemiwas, or sacrifice throws. And anyone who knows me from coaching in the Blue Basement knows I am a huge fan of 3 sutemiwas in particular. Tomoe-nage, the throw where we put a foot on the hip and send our man through. Sumigeshi, where we put a foot inside the hip and send the man over our shoulders. We sacrifice our back to the ground and throw them over our shoulders. And ukewaza, where we use a foot to trip our opponent's foot while we sacrifice to the ground and send them over. These 3 takedowns score very, very highly on the criteria we talked about for appropriateness for jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu players are already using them down on the floor, so I fully believe that within a fairly short time frame, jiu-jitsu players can be using these effectively. Now, they represent a higher skill level than the techniques we talked about in volume 1, but they're still very doable. This is not like a 10-year project or anything crazy like that. When we get into further volumes, then we'll be looking at takedowns which require more standing skills. It's going to be more of a long-term project. So we'll be looking at throws like osotogari and taitoshi, and these kataguruma throws like this, which are still very appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu and still easier to learn, especially the variations I'm going to teach. I honestly believe there are certain, within any given takedown, there are variations which are easier for most students to learn. So, for example, a standard osotogari, as it's standardly taught, is quite a difficult move to perform on a resisting opponent. You're on one leg and hopping around, and it's pretty easy for your opponent to counter you if you don't do things right from the start. But there are other variations of it, which I'll outline in the videos, which are considerably easier for most people to perform. And that's the direction I'll be pushing. As each video comes out, the skills required will be a little higher, and the projects will be slightly more long-term. But volume 1 is, in a sense, what you need to know right from the start to get good in a pretty short time frame and confidently go out and make grips with people, move them around, and start scoring points in the standing position. And then we go into volume 2, slightly more difficult, slightly longer time frame, and then culminating in volume 3, where now we're starting to talk about pretty high amplitude throws, where we're taking people down with some authority. And yes, there will be more back exposure, so there's more risk involved, but there's also the reward of a stronger takedown. Yep. You can throw someone with some authority.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, John.
Now, Bernardo, we've talked about standing position and takedowns in the context of sport jiu-jitsu. Now, you and I, more than anything, we participate in jiu-jitsu because we love the sport.
Yeah.
Okay, and you were a competitor. I'm a coach, and our first love is the competitive mat. Okay,
Yep.
You from an athlete's perspective, me from a coaching perspective. But let's say something now which is dear to the heart of both of us, even as sportsmen in jiu-jitsu. There's a sense in which when you play the sport of jiu-jitsu, takedowns are a choice. When you go out and the match begins, you can choose to do a takedown, but you could also choose to pull guard.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't have to take someone down. You can just pull guard. Okay, so in sport jiu-jitsu, takedowns are a choice.
Yeah.
But in fighting jiu-jitsu, takedowns are a necessity.
Yeah.
Okay, when you're in a fight,
even on MMA or on a street fight.
I'm talking about street fighting now.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't just sit down to your butt in a street fight.
I agree.
Okay, you're going to get soccer kicked, and it's going to end badly.
Yeah.
I'll say it again because it's very important. In sport jiu-jitsu, takedowns are a choice. But in fighting jiu-jitsu, takedowns are a necessity. And I think there's a sense in which every jiu-jitsu student has within them the idea that we all began jiu-jitsu with some sense of self-defense.
Yeah.
Okay? As we stayed in the sport, we got more and more attracted to the sport of jiu-jitsu. But when you first begin, an undeniable part of the attraction of jiu-jitsu is the ability to defend yourself.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we all have a responsibility to learn takedowns.
I agree.
Okay, all of us. I actually began my study of jiu-jitsu very late, at the age of 28, and my motivation was self-defense. I was working as a bouncer in New York City. I spent more than a decade of my life working as a bouncer, and all of my early interest in jiu-jitsu had nothing to do with sport. It had everything to do with learning to make my job as a bouncer easier and safer. And so my whole introduction to the sport of jiu-jitsu had nothing to do with sport. Now, people know me now as a sports coach, but that wasn't how I started. I started as a bouncer. And my first interest was, how am I going to defend myself using jiu-jitsu to make my life easier in what were often very hazardous situations. I learned a lot of lessons over the years. Okay, as I said, I spent more than a decade in New York City. I began bouncing in New York in 1991. You weren't in New York in 1991, Bernardo, but that was the year where New York City had its peak rate for murder. And New York was a very different city in 1991 than it is now. I worked many clubs which had interesting clientele who there was a lot of action, and I got many opportunities to use jiu-jitsu in the context of self-defense. I learned a lot of lessons over the years, and I want to show one day a BJJ Fanatics video which specializes in the idea of jiu-jitsu for self-defense.
Yep.
Okay, and I would love to give the lessons that I learned over that decade of street fighting and jiu-jitsu. There's a lot to be said about that, but that's in the future. What I would like to do in volume 1 is to have a bonus section where we just talk about jiu-jitsu takedowns for self-defense.
For self-defense, that's awesome.
Now, most of what we do is for sport. Okay, volume 1 is mostly about the sport of jiu-jitsu, taking someone down. But I said this before, and I'll say it again. At the deepest level, all of us as jiu-jitsu students have a sense that in sport, takedowns are a choice, but in fighting, takedowns are a necessity. Now, the good news is when you get into most street fights, you're not fighting a trained athlete. You're not being asked to take down a judo Olympian or a collegiate wrestler. You're fighting, in most cases, someone who's had
drunk,
either no training or maybe intoxicated, or has only minimal training, or perhaps has some kind of athletic background. They're a good athlete in other sports, but they're not a specialized fighter. You'd have to be pretty unlucky to get into a street fight with an Olympic judo player. That would suck. But that maybe then you could pull down. So there's that in your favor. You don't have to be the best takedown guy in the world, but you got to know what you're doing. So what I typically find is that many of the takedowns that are easiest to learn for sport competition, like a collar drag, is a very good sport takedown, but it's not an appropriate takedown for street fighting. Okay, ankle picking, one of my favorite ways to begin students taking people down for jiu-jitsu competition. Not really appropriate for street fighting. It's probably better than a collar drag, but not ideal. Okay, so what I do want to show is okay. One day in the future, I will put out, I promise you, a specialized video series on jiu-jitsu applications for self-defense. But for now, I just want to give you a quick look at jiu-jitsu applications for self-defense in volume 1, because I think every jiu-jitsu student has a responsibility to be able to apply takedowns in a confrontational situation as part of their self-defense. And I will say this, guys, my beliefs about takedowns for self-defense purposes are quite a bit different from the traditional jiu-jitsu curriculum. You're not going to see a basic hip throw. You're not going to see like a headlock defense. It's not going to be part of it. I never found these things to be any useful part of my experience in bouncing. What I did find useful, I'm going to show you in the video. I'm going to give you my personal criteria for what I believe are the best takedowns for self-defense applications in street fighting, and give you a brief insight which you can take with you as part of your essential first skills. And volume 1 is essentially about that, Bernardo. I believe the basic overview of volume 1, feet to floor, is this. I want you, as I said earlier, to be able, in a sport context, to take someone your own size and your own skill level and start scoring points on them in 3 to 6 months. I want you to have a good, solid grasp of the precursor skills: stance, gripping, motion, breaking balance, and position, which are going to make you effective in the standing position. I want you to have a small curriculum of takedowns from the front and takedowns from the back, which really work in jiu-jitsu competition. And lastly, I want you to be effective and know what you ought to be doing in a self-defense or street fight situation, so that you have takedowns that are appropriate for the sport, and you also know in the back of your mind some takedowns that are appropriate for a situation where it's not sporting, it's self-defense or street fight. And I believe that would be a great thing for a jiu-jitsu student who perhaps didn't have much knowledge of the standing position, but was always curious about it and feels they have some kind of need to learn the standing position and incorporate it into both their sport game and their self-defense aspirations in jiu-jitsu.
Oh, John, funny story here. Like when I started jiu-jitsu when I was 14 years old, a big reason was to defend myself. And then I remember that I started jiu-jitsu and I loved it. But I also ended up doing a little bit of Muay Thai because I was not very confident. I was like, man, what about if someone tries to beat me up and I don't get taken down? What's going to happen? I got to know at least how to...
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can see like how important is the takedowns, as you were saying. And so your goal is to have this kind of like mini subject as a bonus in volume 1 for the feet to floor.
Yes.
No, that's awesome.
Just because I believe the deepest reason why I think many students in jiu-jitsu want to learn takedowns has nothing to do with sport. Because the truth is, as we said earlier, you can be a world champion in jiu-jitsu without knowing a single takedown. But all of us have the sense deep inside us that, man, jiu-jitsu was a 4-step system, and guess what step 1 is? Takedown.
And it's, maybe I would say like it's not even like 100% a takedown, but it's a standing game. Because if you go if you're fighting on the street and you go to the person's back, you're fine. You don't even need to taking down. You can, but this sense of like what we're gonna do now that you're standing, I think we miss that a lot.
And so I want to do this. And as I said, guys, one day I will put out a full series on jiu-jitsu applications in self-defense based on what I learned over a decade bouncing in New York City. But I think something would be seriously wrong with a takedown series that literally only incorporated moves that can only be done on a mat. Okay, I just don't think that would be right. Jiu-jitsu players should also know how to take someone down in a situation where you're on concrete and someone's throwing punches at you. There's no grip fighting. They're trying to knock your head off. And I will show something of that in this video, so that students will have a great background to score points in competition, sport jiu-jitsu, and at the end they should also know, okay, that's good for sport. Tell me how to take someone down who has bad intentions towards me on the street. And I will show a little something. It won't be complete. It won't be the whole guide to self-defense. That'll come later. But you should know how to modify takedowns for non-sporting situations.
No, man, that's awesome, John. I think that's such a great idea.
Yeah. Bernardo, we've been talking a little bit about the differentiation between jiu-jitsu and other grappling arts, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the idea of amplitude, as we talked about it in the interview. The idea that most grappling styles, judo, sambo, wrestling, reward amplitude, and jiu-jitsu doesn't. Okay, in jiu-jitsu, the smallest takedown, the smallest trip scores exactly the same as the biggest high amplitude body slamming takedown. Let's go back into the history of grappling, judo in particular. Always there's been this question, who was the greatest thrower in judo history with a jacket on? I said, but there are great throwers in wrestling, but that's a very different sport. When you got a jacket on, who are the greatest throwers in history? And always you'll see there's three names that tend to come up more than any other. There's many possible candidates, but three people always you'll hear their name mentioned. One, of course, is Kimura. Every jiu-jitsu player is familiar with Kimura because he fought Elio Gracie. But in judo, people often say, before Kimura there was no Kimura, and after Kimura there was no more Kimura. Like he's considered like one of the absolute all-time great throwers, and he was a devastating thrower. People often talk about the idea that when Kimura would visit judo academies and train at unfamiliar places, people knew that his osotogari was so devastating that people used to get knocked out cold by his osotogari, like knocked out like boxing. And they would ask him, please, no osotogari. You can throw me, but no osotogaris, because no one wanted to get knocked out. That's how powerful his throws were. Another guy who's often cited is Yasuhiro Yamashita, the great judo player of the 1970s and early 1980s. He also was just a devastating thrower. I think he had some crazy international record, like 203-0 international, like something insane. Like no one's ever going to beat that for a record. He's another widely cited person as, okay, this guy was the greatest thrower of all time. And more recently, there's a fellow named Kosei Inoue, who was also a devastating thrower. He had a period from like 1999 to 2003 where he was just throwing everybody in the world with beautiful high amplitude throws. And most people say it's one of those three guys who was the greatest thrower of all time. So definitely Kimura is up there. If he's not the best of all time, then he's top three. Okay. Now, an interesting thing about Kimura is that he talks in his biography, his autobiography, about his experiences in in All Japan competition. Now, at the time Kimura was competing, there was no Olympic judo. Judo was not as international when Kimura was competing as it is today. Back then, if you wanted to see the best players in the world, you had to go to Japan. And in those days, and arguably even today, the All Japan Championship was the premier competition in the world. It's to be considered the best in the world, you had to win the All Japans. And Kimura won All Japans on numerous occasions and would have won a lot more if World War II hadn't gotten in the way. Now he talks about his competition. Now let's bear in mind Kimura is a man legendary for his high amplitude throws. Okay, this is a guy who had in unbelievably powerful Osotogari, a devastating Ippon Sanagi. He also had numerous other good throws. He had a very good Horaigoshi. He had a very good Sumigeshi too, by the way. So this is a guy who could throw people with tremendous power. Now, when he talks about his competition, you're going to see some interesting things. I'm going to give you a few quotes. This is taken from his autobiography. He's talking about a match that he had with a star judo player of his time, Nakajima, and the two were very evenly matched. Okay, this was a tough fight early in Kimura's career. So he says, please bear in mind, guys, in the time that Kimura was competing, judo matches were a lot longer. Okay, they were very long matches. It's not like today where it's 6 minutes and it's over. When Kimura was competing, they could have 20, even 40-minute matches. So he talks about this. In the latter half of round 2, okay, they had divisions into rounds in judo in those days, I reversed Nakajima's Osotogari, and I tried to pin him with a side pin. But he held my right leg with his legs, half guard. And round 2 ended. After 30 minutes of battle, you imagine doing judo with someone like that for 30 minutes? They were tough back in those days. Both my skin and my judo gi was soaked with sweat. Sweat was dripping in so much quantity that I could hardly open my eyes. I had to open my eyes alternately just to see my opponent. Before the next overtime, myself and Nakajima sat on our knees to bring our judo gis to the proper position. I tried to untie my belt, but I could not generate enough force in my hands to even do this. The knot felt as hard as a stone. My fingers were almost completely powerless, so it took me a long time to fix my gi. Then I looked at Nakajima, and I saw him extend his legs alternately and rub his calves with his hands. And I thought to myself, those legs are the key to my victory. I retightened my black belt and I watched his motion carefully. And as soon as the judge announced start, I tackled his legs. He fell down to his buttocks and I caught him in a side pin. And I thought to myself, this is my last chance to win. I frantically held him down and pinned him. The long, intense battle, which lasted 40 minutes, finally ended. Now let's think about this, Bernardo. You have arguably the greatest thrower of all time, who can throw like no one else in history has thrown. And when he got into a fight where he couldn't throw his opponent, and he was exhausted and had nothing left in the tank, what did he do? He tackled him. He hit him with a double leg takedown. Now that's not a high amplitude throw, is it? He just fell to his buttocks. He says in his own words, he fell to his butt. And that was enough. He pinned him, finished him on the ground. So what do you have here? The best thrower, arguably the best thrower in history, when he couldn't get his throws to work, he went for a low amplitude takedown and he won on the ground. And that's exactly what jiu-jitsu players have to do. We're not interested in amplitude. We're not interested in the biggest, fanciest throw. You just got to get them down and then let the ground work the magic, just like Kimura did. So what do you have there? You have this lesson that you had the best thrower in the world, and he's happy to hit a double leg. When none of the throws were working, he went for the easier throw.
Last resource.
That was his last resort, and it worked brilliantly, and he won a match that he otherwise would have lost. Jiu-jitsu players need to take some inspiration from that. Here's another quote from Kimura, talking about another match. He had a particularly tough opponent one year, a guy called Ishikawa, who ended up, I believe, coming to America to teach in his old age. But he fought Ishikawa in apparently one of the toughest judo matches of all time. He talks about this. In the final, I faced Ishikawa, 6 dan. The platform we fought on was very small. When I attempted an attack, he quickly escaped outside the platform. The chief referee, Kyoza Mifune, who himself was a legend of judo, did not give chui. I then tackled him down, double leg, and attempted osakomi, a pin. But again, he escaped to the outside of the small competition arena. I then tried my big seanagi. Again, he retreated and escaped outside the mats again. It was like pushing against the curtain. After all this went on, the bout went into overtime. I tackled him down again and caught him in a pin, but he crawled off the platform and escaped. The second overtime started. I attempted Osotogari, Kimura's favorite throw. His body wobbled, but he withstood the pressure, and he countered me with Taitoshi. So Kimura's favorite throw, the one he was most famous for, didn't work. When I pushed him, he again escaped outside. Now, he talks about the end of the match. In the end, this match went the distance, with neither one able to throw each other. But again, guys, you can see the same pattern is emerging. When Kimura couldn't get his big throws to work,
He was trying to
double leg. He's trying to go in for the low amplitude move, and he's trying to win on the floor. Okay? So again, we have the same theme, that the best thrower of all time, arguably the best thrower of all time, when he's in trouble, he goes for the double leg. He just tackles the legs. Here he talks about another match that he had. And so you can see this is a common theme in his work. My first opponent was Hattori, 6-dan. His specialty, he talks about his opponent's specialties, Kojigari, Taitoshi. We both exhausted all the techniques we had, but round one ended in a draw. In overtime, he scored with a takedown and made him fall. He goes through, and then he says, my second opponent was Osawa, 5th dan from Chiba. He was a small man, but he had the reputation of being the greatest Ashiwaza master of his generation. The bout started, I tried to grab him, but he was very elusive. I stopped chasing him and stepped back. He advanced for a few steps, and I jumped in for a tackle, double leg. He was caught off guard and fell to the floor. He tried to get up immediately, but I had already initiated my pin. I scored Ippon with a side pin. So again, he had a frustrating opponent that he couldn't deal with. What did he do? Double-legged him. Okay. So what have you got here? You got a lesson that you get people who are absolutely among the greatest throwers of all time. Okay. Kimura is, if not the greatest of all time, he's top 3 of all time. And yet when he gets in trouble and the opponent's tough, on multiple occasions, as I just read it out to you, he double-legged people. There's a lot to be said there for the idea of just getting your opponent down to the ground. In jiu-jitsu, you don't have to be the biggest thrower. And even the biggest throwers, when they get in trouble, can profit from the idea of a simple leg attack. Grab him by the legs, take him down, win on the ground. Okay? I'll give you another example from a more modern era. Two of the greatest judo players of the modern era came from Korea. Okay, one of my all-time favorite judo players is a guy called Won-hee Lee. He was the 2004 Olympic champion. This guy, there was a short period of 2 to 3 years where this guy, I believe, and I think a lot of people will agree with me, was pound for pound the best thrower on the planet. He was a devastating thrower. He had beautiful, beautiful judo. He had a pretty wide curriculum of throws. He had many throws, but in particular, he was known for his taitoshi. He had a beautiful, beautiful taitoshi on both sides. He could throw left and right. As I said, he won a World Championships in 2003, and he won the Olympic gold medal in 2004. In 2005, he was widely considered to be the best thrower in the world, pound for pound. Something strange happened. In 2005, he went to the Korean Nationals to win the Nationals and get on the Korean team and compete in the 2005 World Championships. An unknown teenager called Wang Ki-chun came in and fought him. And this 19-year-old went toe-to-toe with Won-hee Lee, who was considered to be the best in the world. Ki-chun Wang would go on to become an Olympic silver medalist and a world champion himself. But he's very young at the time. And he was taking on the established champion, who many people believe was the best in the world. The young guy, Wang, was a stud, and Lee was an uber stud, the best in the world, according to most people. And they went at each other toe-to-toe. You had, in retrospect, what I believe at that time were the 2 best pound-for-pound throwers in the world going at each other head-to-head in the Korean Nationals. Neither one could get a throw on the other. They were just too damn good. Okay, they were so good at gripping, stance, motion, and throwing that they just couldn't get anything to work. Lee, who had a devastating taitoshi, couldn't throw Chun. Chun, who also has a devastating Tai Toshi, couldn't throw Lee. And when their takedowns completely negated each other, what did they do?
Double legs.
Wasn't a double leg. Ki-Chun Wang hit him with an ankle pick.
Ankle pick.
Now, in judo, an ankle pick doesn't score a lot.
And it was allowed back then.
Back then it was allowed. It wasn't until 2010 that it got banned. He hit him with a little ankle pick. It wasn't much, but it got him down. It didn't put him on his back with force and projection. It just knocked him on his ass. It scored just enough to take the decision to the youngster, the 19-year-old. And to everyone's absolute shock, the best judo player in the world got eliminated by the 19-year-old.
Yeah.
Now, that 19-year-old went on to win the world championships.
I get it.
Okay, and then when he fought other people, he threw them like crazy. He threw everyone with Tominagi.
Yeah, but what he used to beat him was...
when he took on the best guy in the world, he took down used a very simple, very low amplitude takedown, because the big guns don't work at that level. Okay, when you have two guys who are absolutely matched in skill level, it's very hard to throw them with a high amplitude throw. But it's a lot easier just to trip them and put them down. Okay, and again, the same lesson that Kimura gave. When Kimura couldn't get his big throws to work, what did he do? He attacked the legs.
Yep.
When Ki-Chun Wang couldnn get his big throws to work on One-Hee Lee and vice versa, what did they do? They attacked each other's legs. One-Hee Lee would go for knee picks, and Ki-Chun Wang went for ankle picks. And you get the same theme, that when the big guns aren't working, go in with the little guns. And jiu-jitsu players can be confident that even the best players in the world can be taken down with these simple leg attacks.
Yeah,
and they're a lot easier to get to work. When you're exhausted, frustrated, and can't get the big guns to work, these will still work for you. Okay? And that's why a big part of the Feet to Floor Volume 1 is invested in attacks to the legs, ankle picks, single legs, knee picks, and double legs. Just as they work for the great throwers.
We're going right to the most efficient ones.
They're the ones that are going to take it down. They're not going to score big points. Okay, they're not going to be a high amplitude throw where you take the guy up and dump him flat on his back, but they'll take him down to the ground. And in jiu-jitsu, they all score the same. Every takedown's 2 points, regardless of amplitude. So these techniques, which were used by the greatest throwers of all time, when they couldn't get their big guns to work, are perfect for the sport of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense.
So if they're using them, why shouldn't we be? And then like Kimura did, let the victory be won down on the floor. All you got to do is get him to his butt, and then win on the ground with your pins and your submissions on the floor.
Yeah, no, that was awesome, John. I love it to hear the story, and I think a story has the power of telling what's truth and what's not, right? Because if you see those guys using...
These are the heroes of the sport. These guys were incredible athletes. Like, as I said, greatest throwers of all time. These guys are up there. And when you see, man, this is what they do, then that inspires you to do the same thing.
No, I agree.
You learn from from their efforts, and that's how you make forward progress. Okay, if we don't learn from the past, how are we going to make forward progress into the future?
Yeah, no, I agree 1,000,000%. No, that was awesome. So, John, I think this entire interview here was great to clarify like what's coming. And so, guys, the next series of John, so the first one was the Answer the System. Second one was the Go For It Faster, and this third one is going to be the Feet to Floor. And we are super, super, super excited about it. And the first part is coming out very, very soon. So I think that was amazing.
I think it's there's a sense in which I want to do this series. I'm very passionate about the series Feet to Floor because, as I said earlier, I've always identified there being two primary weaknesses in jiu-jitsu. Okay, and it was always, for me, the two biggest weaknesses of jiu-jitsu were leg locks and standing position. Okay, as much as I love jiu-jitsu, let's be frank, those were two areas of weakness. And I've always been proud of the fact that my students were a huge part of rectifying the first weakness, the leg lock problem. And now I want to address the second weakness of jiu-jitsu. When I go to my grave, I want to know that I actively improved the sport of jiu-jitsu in two of its greatest weaknesses. And that's a project and a goal that's very dear to my heart. And I want to start this with the Feet to Floor series. And it'll be a shorter series. Like Into the System, I believe, was six volumes. And Go Further Faster, I believe, was 9 volumes,
Yep.
8 or 9 volumes. And this one will probably be shorter. It'll probably be around 3 volumes. And the first one is, I think, for most jiu-jitsu players, the most practical one. Because the average jiu-jitsu player doesn't really have a lot of skills in the standing position, may not have a lot of knowledge or even a broad idea of what they're supposed to be doing in the standing position. And it's specifically addressed for those people. And it's designed to get people moving quickly in a direction to score points against someone their own size, their own skill level in a very short time frame, like 3 to 6 months. Then we build on that with longer term skills as we go further into the series. But the idea is to build a curriculum and a skill set which is appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu and gets people scoring and converts jiu-jitsu, what was traditionally a jiu-jitsu weakness, into a jiu-jitsu strength. We did it with leg locks. We can do it with a standing position too.
No, I agree 100%, John. And I think the fact that this series is going to be a little shorter is great too, because standing is one part of jiu-jitsu, right? So it's not the entire jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
So no, we're super excited. We have no doubts that's going to be another great one. And with your series, I feel almost like when I was a kid that I would buy a album about the soccer World Cup, and whenever I would not finish the album, I would keep waiting for the next one. So I think that's how people might be feeling with our series too, because
I'm super
you
excited.
Get all of them. You know,
No, so it's actually been interesting filming. Bernardo's been there for all of the filming, and it's in between takes we talk about our experience, me as a coach and Bernardo as an athlete, and so many of the ideas and concepts we share here about what are the problems of jiu-jitsu and how these can be rectified. And it's been a fascinating thing involved in this filming process so far. So I'm very enthusiastic about the project itself, to rectify one of the great historical weaknesses of jiu-jitsu, and we've already resolved one historical weakness. We can do it with the other one as well.
Yeah, so guys, it's going to be at bjjfanatics.com soon. John's the best-selling instructor in the store, so make sure you don't miss that. Os.